How about this? The U.S. Park Police are...
Let's start by storming Blackgate!
What's going on, everyone? So welcome to my latest video. This is obviously part of a series where I focus on a specific director and rank that director's work from worst to best. Done such directors in the past such as Spike Lee, Spike Jonze, Wes Anderson, Paul Thomas Anderson, the list goes on. You guys can check that out in my director playlist down below. But guys, you clicked on this video, so you know at this time around I'm focusing on Peter Jackson's films and ranking them from worst to best. And this will not include any documentaries, short films, music videos, TV shows, none of that. Just specifically feature-length films. As of filming this video, April 2022, Peter Jackson's done 13 feature-length films, so I'll be ranking them from 13 being his worst to 1 being his best, and of course my opinion. And speaking of opinions, I'll be very curious to hear your guys' thoughts in the comment section below on what Peter Jackson's ranking list looks for you. But anyways, guys, enough exposition. Let's get started. So kicking things off with number 13, we have Bad Taste. This movie, the behind the scenes are far more fascinating than the movie itself. The movie itself really isn't that good. I personally am not a fan of. I know it has a cult following, but behind the scenes I did quite like. I liked hearing about how Peter Jackson worked on this movie every weekend for like 4 years. That's honestly very inspirational. You can tell that that hardworking method would honestly go on to really spread throughout the other 12 movies that he did. Props goes to him for making Bad Taste. Just not a movie I personally liked. That is why it's my number 13. Next up, my number 12 is The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies. So I'm not a fan of this movie. I think that this movie really kind of made the Hobbit trilogy end on a whimper. All the faults of this trilogy are in high form with this movie, though. Obvious CGI, check. A lack of production design that really emphasizes, practical effects over CGI. Check, unfortunately. I wanted more practical effects, but unfortunately that's not the case. Also, we just have all of this fan service that really feels forced. It doesn't feel natural in the slightest. Like, okay, if you have fan service, fine, whatever. But if you have it where it's forced, it's so annoying. Battle sequences are also just so been there, done that. It's not an interesting movie, unfortunately. And that is why it's my number 12. Next up, my number 11 is the opposite. This is an interesting movie, and that is Meet the Feebles. So Meet the Feebles is my number 11. I gotta say, with Meet the Feebles, this is a movie that I respect more than I actually enjoyed watching it. Like, watching it felt like... I don't even know what it felt like. It felt like I was watching a bad dream, honestly. But I respect the sheer ambition of this movie, as well as the fact that Peter Jackson was like, you know what? Let's get puppets and make them really messed up. Let's make them, do all these, drugs, alcohol, booze, and, curse and everything. Let's do that. And I don't know, I give him props for, the fact that he did that. I think that that's something that's interesting. And in a world that was before Ted and before Happy Time Murders, I mean, I got to give props for props too. But again, there were just a lot of things in this movie that I thought was like a mess, especially tonally speaking. But it's still a movie that, at some point I might show friends just to be like, hey guys, you want to watch this movie? It's kind of crazy. But other than that, I mean, not much to recommend. But yeah, that's why it's my number 11. Next up, my number 10 is The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey. So this is the first entry in the Hobbit trilogy, and I really liked it the first time I saw it in theaters, but then a couple weeks after I saw it in theaters, I went to see it again, and it was in the high frame rate. I think it was 60 frames per second in 3D, and I didn't like it the second time. I really didn't, and I haven't revisited it since then, to be honest. I wanted to like it. I did, but it was one of those situations where, because I watched it a second time, and even over the last couple of weeks between viewings of the first and second, I felt like marinating on everything. I was like, yeah, this really has a lot of issues. Like, it takes so long to get going. There's so much exposition that feels forced, and honestly just trying to be, a homage and really kind of being like, hey, remember Lord of the Rings? And it's like, yeah, we get it. Remember Lord of the Rings because we love Lord of the Rings. That's why we're watching this. But also the villains are very weak. The supporting characters such as Radagast are just like cringeworthy. I'm not a big fan of this movie. And then also when it starts to get going, it then ends. So, yeah, not a fan of it, and that's why it is my number 10. Next up, my number 9 is The Hobbit, Desolation of Smaug. So this one is a bit better, simply put, because you have Smaug. Benedict Cumberbatch does such a great job as Smaug. You also have the barrel sequence, on the rapids. I think that's utterly cartoonish, and that just is something that really kind of represents the trilogy as a whole. It's very cartoonish. It's very much so something you feel like you really can't take seriously, and especially during that sequence. But I think that's why I had fun with it, because it felt like they were kind of in on it, that it's just so ludicrous and so, like, jokey. But I thought it was well choreographed. But besides that, there's really not much that stands out about this movie. It's a mid-chapter entry, so it does have those, like, growing pains in terms of pacing and tone. But still, I did like it a bit better, and that's why it's my number 9. Next up, my number 8 is Heavenly Creatures. Kate Winslet gives a great performance. Not much else that I can personally say is memorable about this movie. It's very much one of those movies where you watch it, and as you're watching, you're like, yeah, it's mildly engaging, but then as soon as you end it, you're like, oh man, I got to get over to Letterboxd to quickly write something. Otherwise, I'm going to forget about this movie. And yeah, but Kate Winslet's performance, I think, is it's so good that I like it a bit more than the other entries on this list. Barely, just because of her performance. But yeah, that is my number 8. Next up, my number 7 is The Lovely Bones. This movie is frustrating because on one hand, I really like Stanley Tucci's character. I mean, not his character per se, but his acting, I think, is just excellent of that character. And the character itself is just fascinating. Problem with the movie, simple. It's focused so much on the afterlife and what the family's dealing with and everything that it just really gets bogged down in those sequences. And it's a shame because when you have Stanley Tucci given one of the best performances of that year, anytime you go to him, you're fascinated, you're glued, you're like, okay, what's going to happen next? So it's just a very disjointed mess because you didn't really have that feeling while watching the parents and everything and her, in the afterlife and everything, because during those sequences, you're like, it feels kind of schmaltzy. So it was a disjointed combination of tones. You have sentimentality and then serial killer drama. I don't know. It's something that I kind of wish worked, but unfortunately it didn't. And I also do think that it being PG-13 kind of made it hold back on the violence and everything. And I feel like it was kind of necessary during some sequences to really kind of hit home certain things. But, at the end of the day, Stanley Tucci's performance alone makes this the best of all the other entries that I mentioned on this list. And that is why it's my number 7. Next up, my number 6 is The Frighteners. So Michael J. Fox. Really good performance in this movie. It's a fun movie. It's really well done in terms of the visual effects for the most part. Some elements haven't really aged too well, but it's still a movie that I have fun with while watching, even if I know that it is flawed. But yeah, that is my number 6. Next up, my number 5 is Brain Dead. So this is a movie that I gave, I think, like a 3 out of 5, but I already know I want to revisit it because it's a movie that's just so over the top with the violence that you can't help but be gleeful about it and just kind of appreciate what you're watching, especially because it's all practical effects. So that makes it all the better in my eyes. But it is a movie that, again, it is kind of just okay-ish, but it is a movie also that I feel like maybe upon multiple viewings that I'll appreciate even more. And that's why it's my number 5. Next up, my number 4 is King Kong. So yeah, I own this in 4K. I happen to actually really like this movie. This is probably top 3 monster movies for me. I really, really like this movie. The length is not an issue for me. In fact, I watched the extended cut. I can't lie. I'm in love with this movie. I love what it does. How it's like before you get on the ship itself, the island, and then New York City. It's like almost like a 4-act structure if you think about it. But it never feels like it's too long. It always feels purposeful, at least for me personally. And I really liked also how they developed the characters so that way when things happen, you actually care about what goes on with them. So I personally really like King Kong. I know it has its detractors, but I think it's very much so worthy of those 3 Oscars that it won back in 2005. But yeah, that's my number 4. Next up, my number 3. So I'm just going to bring out the whole trilogy just because that's what my last 3 are. My number 3 is Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. The mid-chapter of this trilogy. It's not my favorite of the trilogy, but it's still a great movie. It's still got one of the best action scenes you'll ever see in terms of especially battles. Helm's Deep, incredible. Great performances, very emotional, tightly edited, tightly paced, great cinematography, great costume design. It all comes together, but it is a bit flawed, just a bit, and that's why it's my number 3. Next up, my number 2 is The Fellowship of the Ring. The Fellowship of the Ring, I think, is a perfect film, and I think it's a perfect example on how to make a first entry in a trilogy. Make it so that way it can hold up on its own, whilst at the same time give a little bit of kernel of what you're to expect with the second one, so that way there'll be people that want to see it. Not that whole, this whole movie is just a setup for the next one, so that way it feels very empty. I like the fact that Fellowship of the Ring does such a great job of being able to actually, warrant its existence, if you will. But that's why it's my number 2. Next up, my number 1, you guys probably already guessed it, but my number 1 is Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. I personally love this film. I know some people really don't like how there's like 10 different endings, and I can respect that. But I also think just because I was so attached to all these characters, like I can see why, for me personally, it worked. But I also understand why some people might not think that this movie worked. And at the end of the day, this used to be one of my favorite movies. It used to be top 3. It's still up there for me for sure. But it's a film that you can't help but respect. You can't help but sit back and say, wow, this is such an ambitious film. And yeah, it's my favorite Peter Jackson film. So yeah, guys, that is my ranking for Peter Jackson's films. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below on what your ranking list looks for his work. And as always, guys, don't forget the subscription, notification bell, follow me on Letterboxd, and I will catch you guys later.